I am honored and delighted to have some very special guests today. I have Dr. Lou Markos, Jason Barney, and Dr. Patrick Egan here. And we're going to discuss how Charlotte Mason fits into the classical tradition this evening. So I'd like to have each one of them introduce themselves to you and maybe share a little bit about how the first time they read Charlotte Mason, how did she strike them, especially as it would pertain to the tradition of classical education. So if one of you would jump in and introduce yourself and sort of share a little bit about your relationship with Charlotte Mason in the classical tradition, I would really appreciate that.
Well, I guess I'll jump in. My name's Lou Markos. I'm a professor of English and scholar in residence at Houston Christian University. And I do a lot of writing on Lewis, Tolkien, classical education, ancient Greece and Rome, and also the Romantics and the Victorians. And actually, the reason I got turned on to Charlotte Mason is our wonderful hostess right here. I was speaking for Responsive Ed, and you were working for them then, and you gave me some books about Charlotte Mason, one written by, I think, the daughter of Francis Schaeffer, I believe.
That's correct. Yes.
Right? Yeah. And I came home and we had some terrible thunderstorm or whatever, but school was canceled for 2 days. And so I just dove into it. And even though these days I'm talking more about Lewis and the classics, my dissertation's on Wordsworth. And as I read Charlotte Mason, I was amazed at what I was seeing as what I see as a positive romanticism, the romanticism of Wordsworth and Coleridge, rather than the more excessive romanticism of Shelley and Byron, though I do love them. But I saw something here that was romantic, but was still focused on truth. It's just that the romantics try to go to different places to find truth, but they actually believe there is real truth that's kind of universal. And also a sort of respect for the tradition that doesn't crush spontaneity. So I was really pleased. I'd often heard, oh, Charlotte Mason, she's the opposite of Dorothy Sayers. And I didn't really find it that way. I found somebody that has a love for children and wants to use the kind of good aspects of childhood and pedagogy that were discovered by the more Christian romanticists, and that I think we still need to use.
Okay. Thank you, Lou.
Well, I can jump off of Dr. Markos there. My name's Jason Barney. Excited to be discussing Charlotte Mason. And for me, really, my journey into classical education and Charlotte Mason's philosophy came at the same time. I was coming out of undergrad and I joined a school that was influenced both by Charlotte Mason and the classical tradition. And so I was reading in both camps right at the same time, was trained by Bill and Mary Ellen St. Cyr in Charlotte Mason's philosophy of education at Clapham School near Wheaton College, where I had just finished undergrad. And I was an English major, so I was also into Lewis and Coleridge and Wordsworth, and had those kind of underpinnings in my mind as I was then wrestling with Charlotte Mason and getting many of her learned references to Wordsworth quote here, Coleridge there. I had been working through like some of Coleridge's philosophy and theology, his later works. And so it was like all spinning together. So a lot of important ideas. And I would say what struck me was her idea about ideas that and how they strike you. Well, no, I say that in jest, but that was a really important concept for me, and just wrestling through habits, development of children, using narration in the classroom, and really the practical and heart nature of all that she was expressing, how down to earth and with real children she was thinking while still drawing from this broad philosophical tradition for everything.
Hmm. Thank you, Jason. Patrick?
Yeah, I'm Patrick Egan, and I work with Jason with Educational Renaissance. And interestingly, my encounter with classicism and Charlotte Mason was practically sitting alongside Jason.
It's very true.
I had just moved back from Scotland doing my PhD work in biblical studies and was predominantly a university lecturer. And so my encounter with classicism made a lot of sense, having been in the classical world through biblical studies. So Charlotte Mason really revolutionized my pedagogy and in some ways my parenting as well, as I learned how to move on from monodirectional teaching, from lecturing, where the effort and the energy reside in the teacher at the front, and really encouraged the student not just to encounter the text, but to be transformed by it. And I think as we talk about some of the principles of Charlotte Mason, I think this is really the thing that many classicists are finding so attractive about Charlotte Mason, is that she provides methods by which students don't just have a brushing acquaintance with those things that are true, good, and beautiful. But as they assimilate these things into themselves, they are transformed by the power of the gospel, but also by the effect of having these things play out in their minds and in their hearts, in their moral reasoning and the ordering of their affections. And I think these are the values that many classicists desire to see in the classroom. But sometimes the methods are absent. And that's why many of us have turned to Charlotte Mason, is to learn a more coherent pedagogy. And so that was the effect on me, is really having certain principles come together that enabled me to really become that transformative teacher that I really desired to be, and only was able to accomplish in my encounter with Our Lady, Charlotte Mason.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's so wonderful. This was really, I loved everything you all said. I definitely want to touch on the pedagogy part, Patrick, because she definitely has a real definite pedagogy. She's not advocating for an unschooling method where your children are just running in the woods and hugging trees and, undisciplined, without habit formation, virtue training. And so I definitely want that to come up in our conversation. Um, I will say briefly, I think my listeners might like to hear this because I don't think I've ever shared it, that the way I came into Charlotte Mason was actually I had read all of her books and studied her for about 15, 20 years and was homeschooling. And then I decided I really was interested in learning more about classical education, but I didn't want to read the modern books about it. I wanted to do what Charlotte Mason encourages us to do, which is read the experts. And I figured, well, the experts are Plato and Aristotle and Augustine and Quintilian. So I started diving into Plato's dialogues, which are super fun to read. Aristotle, I love politics and ethics, and I love Poetics is my favorite book by him. I've read it multiple times. And every time I would dive into these, what I call the fathers of the tradition, I would find these beautiful golden nuggets of their philosophy and say, oh, that's so very Charlotte Mason. And I have like CM written in the margins of all my classic books. And so I came into classical education after having, a lot of experience with Charlotte Mason and was able to very easily see the commonalities between them. And then that's why I was asked to go work for responsive ed and help stand up 24 schools as classical Charlotte Mason schools. And to my knowledge, they were kind of it was one of the first movements of actually claiming we are a Charlotte Mason classical school. And I had to do a lot of work to make sure that all the teachers understood that she was indeed fitting into the classical tradition, maybe in a slightly different way than they had ever seen before, but there were definitely overlaps that were important. And I think even missing in some what you would call classical schools, such as narration and just a real need to pursue that which is beautiful, incorporating art and music into your lessons, integrating is a really huge thing for Charlotte Mason. Everything is very integrated. Nothing is disconnected. It's very much a humanities approach, in my opinion. And so that was my work at Responsive Ed and at UD. But I would say, I think one of the things that I would like us to talk about is helping our listeners to have some definitions would help. One would be maybe describing what in your mind is the definition of an unschooler, some keywords of what an unschooling approach would look like, but also some touchstones that make up classical education. On my last podcast episode, we talked about basically 4 touchstones that make up a classical education. And I think that would be helpful for us to jump off of. One would be Christ centered, and the second would be that it's rooted in the cultivation of wisdom and virtue. Classical education is going to have an apprenticeship in the 7 liberal arts, both the trivium and quadrivium. And fourthly, classical education is going to focus on the timeless and the traditional, all of which I think Charlotte Mason fits into all 4 of those categories. But I think it's helpful if we can think about those as sort of the points we're jumping from when we're seeing that she fits into the tradition. I see her as being Christ-centered, cultivating wisdom, virtue, apprentice in the 7 liberal arts, and a focus on the timeless and the traditional. So if you guys wouldn't mind, I'd like to you to share some of your thoughts about that and where
Well,
you
I was
see her
saying I
fitting
just
there. Yeah.
spoke at Founders up near Dallas, one of the schools you helped start, and I spoke about the benefits of a classical education. I've got a book coming out in the spring, Passing the Torch, an apology for classical Christian education. And the points I went over, overlap with Charlotte Mason. So the first one is classical Christian education is liberal arts. It's not vocational. And Charlotte Mason is very much liberal arts. It is about forming the character. What I could say, creating virtuous, morally self-regulating citizens. She trusts in the tradition. She has an interdisciplinary approach to literature, history, philosophy, music, art, and also math and science all coming together. So she's dedicated to a true liberal arts education. I was just so happy when you go to Founders, even though it's a public school, ultimately, they do not have a school bell. Thank God. We're not preparing our kids to work in factories. And I don't think people can even imagine a public school without a bell. Well, you know that Mason would hate those bells. The second one, extremely important, it is grounded in the great books of the Western intellectual tradition. And Charlotte Mason says it again and again and again. Stop giving these kids silly little things. Give them the real stories, the real epics, the real poet. She says kids can understand Shakespeare better than we think they can. So she is extremely grounded in the Greco-Roman Judeo-Christian tradition. Number 3, the way I express it is, we not only believe in the great books, we believe in reading the great books. In other words, don't use textbooks, read the books themselves. And Mason makes it clear that we starve these kids' imagination because we don't give them the full story. So she's very much full text, immerse yourself in it. Number 4 is, it's wonderful. She's got a statement where she says we need to basically cut off education from psychology and sociology. That her approach is humanities, humanistic. It is not social science driven. It's not statistic driven. One of the things I love about what she says, I mean, her key phrase: children are born persons. Okay, they are persons with a personality. They are not to be heard. I've just got to read this because Charlotte Mason died 20 years before C.S. Lewis wrote Abolition of Man. And this is how C.S. Lewis distinguishes traditional education from modern education. And he says, where the old education, both classical Christian and Mason, whereas they initiated the young, the new education merely conditions them. The old tradition dealt with its pupils as grown birds deal with young birds when they teach them to fly. The new progressive education deals with them more as the poultry keeper deals with young birds, making them thus or thus for purposes of which the birds know nothing. In a word, the old was a kind of propagation, men transmitting manhood to men. The new is merely propaganda. And I will tell you, if there's one thing that Mason and Sayers would agree about, education protects us from propaganda. That's exactly how Sayers begins her famous Lost Tools of Learning, that these kids cannot distinguish, they can't fight consumerism because we haven't. So there's more that I could talk about, but those are, and then just the last one, classical education is an education in virtue, not values, but an education in virtue. And as we all know, Aristotle told us virtue is a habit. And even though she is not only memorization, she is about forming proper habits intellectually and virtuously in students. So those are some of the absolutely key aspects of classical Christian education. And she just ticks off all of them. And I think she's just as passionate as we are, even if she uses different language sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that comment about virtue and habits is a great stepping off point to consider how much Mason is classical, even though we don't always see her footnotes in the classical literature. There are definitely ways in which she is citing Plato and Aristotle and Augustine, among others. And, Jason has written extensively on narration with this thesis that narration in Mason isn't something brand new, but it is a rediscovery of something in that classical tradition. And maybe he'll comment on that in a little bit. With regard to habits, the way one lives the good life, eudaimonia, is by becoming habituated to those virtues. So virtue ethics has exemplars that you are molded into. And when I read both Plato and Aristotle and the way virtue ethics play out in their philosophy, I think you see much similarity with Jesus and Paul, who would say, we must be conformed to the image of Jesus Christ. Well, what does that conformity consist of? It is daily practices, daily taking up your cross, of living in humility, of praying daily, of striving and wrestling and training. So I think there's a consistency of that biblical, like you had mentioned, that biblical worldview that is grounded in daily habits, that is consistent with that classical tradition. I think those are very much brought into a philosophy that is talking about an anthropology. How do we view children, whole persons, genuine persons with full capabilities? And a view of epistemology. What is the knowledge that we're taking on? It's not just information, it's not just data that we are processing, but that we view all knowledge as these formative things. I really love that beautiful quote. It's manhood being bestowed on men. It's families launching new families as they grow their children. They leave the home, they marry, they leave, they cleave, they form new families in line with that great tradition of biblical Christianity and the cultural edifices that have been a part of that Western tradition. And you would even say the Eastern tradition as well, that I think a lot of this classical and biblical worldview, you see it in the East as well. But I think in that Mason Lewis tradition, we've very much been curators of the great texts of the West. Um, I think we see a lot of alignment with these, and that habit training, that narration are so essential to what Mason is on about, and they are not foreign to classical education.
Mm-hmm.
All that you guys have said so far, I can just kind of double click and amen in one sense. And I think also bringing up the contrast of all of this with the sort of unschooling and extreme Rousseauian kind of spirit of our age goes way back to Rousseau, but this idea that children would be better suited by not being civilized, by not being educated in a formal sense. And we can even hear some modern people on YouTube talking about the straight jacket of education, and there's so much that we want to actually agree with about that. Like in one sense, there are some negatives to industrialized education that we can, as classical Christian educators, resonate with. And the kind of dehumanizing factory approach focus on grades. And so I think all of those things are why some people might look at Mason and see what Mason is and hear something that sounds similar to that kind of extreme unschooling type approach, or just like get him out in nature all the time and don't do any books until they want to on their own and let them self-direct. And there are things that Mason says that for an unwary listener will lead them to think that she's saying the same sort of thing. So when she says that there's no education but self-education, for instance, that can sound like that, whereas what she's really talking about is the need for the student to process and take within himself something very similar that her younger contemporary John Milton Gregory across over here in the States would say, that the students have to process it. So I think part of it is we have to hear her within a tradition. And even these things that we think are kind of new Rousseau ideals of thinking about children and how we could focus on them, they actually have ancient analogs too. And so this focus on children and them being persons, for instance, Mason quotes a Latin saying, Maxima reverentia debetur puris. The greatest reverence is due to boys, to children. An ancient Roman saying about how much we should care for our young children and make sure that they get the very best education. And her Victorian kind of early Edwardian period day, that phrase was being touted around and used in particular to say, don't say anything improper among the young. But she says, no, there's a deeper root here. There's the personhood of the child, and we are undercutting that in so many ways. And so, yeah, I think that maybe places Mason. I think part of why we misunderstand Mason, like we would misunderstand many other great educators in the classical tradition, like Quintilian or others, is that we just aren't aware of the tradition fully, and we think in these false dichotomies. And so, I think that's important to remember. What's classical about her? Well, so much, she participates in this tradition, but there are things that she's speaking in a particular moment as modern education is on the rise, and it hasn't all gone extreme yet, though there are some forces in the background like Rousseau that are pretty extreme. But in Britain, it hadn't really gone that extreme. So I think there are some ways in which she's toggling between the value of modern science, and so taking an Aristotelian theme like the power of habits and trying to tie in the latest brain science of her day to explain that from a Christian perspective is something she's trying to do. Because, like many Christian Victorians in her world, there was an excitement and positivity about the discovery of natural law in science, and not like we're so scared of modern science. That's not how most of the Christians in her day were responding at the time. And so should they have been? I mean, yeah, there was some there's so many mixtures of things going on here. But
Well, Jason, it's interesting because one of the reasons that Sayer's Lost Tools of Learning is so effective is that she's taking new studies in the stages of childhood and putting it together with the ancient trivium. And one of the reasons it works is she is actually interacting with what we might think of as the new science. I don't think it's quite time for Piaget, but going in that direction. And Mason is look, Mason understands that there's something good about Rousseau and even John Dewey, and that is that they want to give an education to all people. She does have a democratizing spirit that wants to educate rich and poor, but not doing it by a lowest common denominator, which is what happens in our country, but by lifting them up into the tradition. Basically, what she says is that Rousseau, his idea of the self-sufficient man, of the noble savage, as we say, is ridiculous. She wants the children free, but they shouldn't be disconnected from the tradition. Then they're not learning anything. And then she says, Haven't you ever read a classic fairy tale to a child and see their eyes light up and see the excitement that is in their eyes? That's what we want to give to all children, not to remove them from the tradition, but to invite them into it.
Well, and
And so,
she wrote a
yeah,
Times response to Maria Montessori, and her
exactly.
main criticism
Yep.
of Montessori, who is a younger contemporary of her, was that she said she doesn't have a place for fairy stories.
Right.
No
Yep.
angels and fairies dance about the child. It's a scientific education too focused on the development of faculties as opposed to letting the child develop as a whole spiritual person naturally. And so she, she makes some interesting contrasts,
Yes.
saying, "Oh, this Rousseau is all about the state of nature," and then he forms this completely unnatural set of circumstances in order to actually raise Emile, which is like so self-contradictory. So I love how
Yeah.
she kind of points out the self-defeating nature of that.
She says that we keep saying we have to teach children how to think. We don't actually have to teach them how to think. That's like saying you have to teach someone how to chew. You have to give them something to think about and something to chew on if they're going to develop. So again, she has a humanistic understanding of the child rather than a mechanical sociological view of the child. And it's so important, even more important today than when she was writing, I think.
Hmm. Patrick, one of the things I'd like you to share a little bit with our listeners, you mentioned, I think, the pedagogy was something that attracted you to her, and it seemed that her pedagogy was aligning very nicely to the tradition, that the classical tradition. When you read the fathers, you're kind of like, this is great. How do I do this? You go to Charlotte Mason, you're like, oh, that's how I do it. So, would you speak to the ideas of her pedagogy that you see as aligned? Maybe some specific examples of pedagogy that you see as aligned to the tradition?
Mhm. So, one of the transformative effects of reading her was the doing away of lecture. And there was a necessary place for lecture in the classical tradition. And the whole reason was the limited access to books. So when you think about before the printing press, and even shortly after the printing press, even though that democratized the book and made books accessible and cheap, the great books were hand produced and they were expensive and they were often in Latin in the original languages. And so where lecture was born from is the professor needed to read aloud the textbook, and in the reading aloud would give explanatory notes as well. Okay? So that's the component that lecture has. Now, when you bring that into the modern world with modern tools and all of that, lecture retained its place despite the fact that we have texts available. And in within the tradition, we were moving on towards more direct engagement with books, with texts, with ideas, with the great literature and the formative nature of those things, right? But in modern education, particularly conventional education, um, in a more technological age, this is accompanied by technology like PowerPoint and video and all of that. And there's this idea that education needs to be entertaining to capture attention, right? And if you lose attention, uh, how will the children learn? And there's also this kind of seedy underbelly of modern education as well. I, as a teacher, will be rated more poorly, and students, there are forums where teachers are rated based on how interesting they are and how easy they grade. Okay, so that gives you a sense that in modern education, it's all very mechanistic and it encourages students to find the easiest path towards the best outcome. All right, so that is modern conventional education. And I would say at its worst, So there are definitely students who are able to carve a pathway through that to be well-formed human beings, right? So we want to grant that. But there is a better way, and that is engaging the students in the work of learning. So we just heard that quote of, that children are engaged in the act of learning. So that's not me coming up with the best possible lecture and PowerPoint. Instead, it's me getting out of the way so that they can have a direct encounter with these rich texts, with the great authors, these beautiful ideas, or paintings, or classical music, or nature itself. And if we have a method for the student to have those encounters with those things, what I become as an educator is less somebody who has to repackage the great ideas and the great authors, distill them. One of the things Charlotte Mason talks about is pre-digested food, kind of like a bird has to pre-digest food in order to give it to the little birds. Um, you have the the full capability of the student to encounter these ideas. And so the work I'm doing is easing the pathway, sometimes helping them overcome some hurdles that might be challenges as they engage with these things. But the whole idea is for the student to encounter something that can be very rigorous, but also life-giving, inspiring, that it quickens the soul. And so, that's me more describing the effect it had on me. And I think the effect it has had on many an educator. So, what happens in classical educators when they don't have a fully coherent pedagogy? There is a tendency and a temptation to revert to modern conventional pedagogical practices. And that's where you have lecture and PowerPoint and classroom management, as opposed to things that are honoring the child's mind and soul. So, hopefully there's a bit of catching what it is we're on about, and me describing somewhat my own experience of this, and pitting one against the other. And I think as classical educators, that's something we need to be intentional and conscientious about, is having pedagogical principles that are consistent with the media that we are having students encounter. So there ought to be a slow, attentive engagement with text, right? And I think as classical educators, because that's what we highly desire, what we find in Mason is somebody who actually helps us plan out and engage students in that direct encounter with the text.
Do we know if Charlotte Mason read John Milton Gregory's Seven Laws of Teaching? Because some of the things that Patrick said, he talks about the need to take it and put it in the child's language, but then they have to engage. And I think he's a little before. I think Gregory is late 19th century, I think.
Yeah, he's publishing about 1900, so
Yeah.
he
So
is a
she
little
could
bit
have read
younger.
him.
I looked into this a little bit some time back. What I can tell, and from reading a couple other works in that time period, it does sound like there's a similar focus amongst many educators on study methods, recitation methods, attention, the attention of the student are all things being talked about a fair amount amongst a number of leading thinkers. So she's in the same world of thought, but she sounds quite different in some ways too. I think
Yeah.
there's a different discourse going on in America at the time.
Mm-hmm.
It's just because
Um,
most classical
but yeah.
Christian educators have a lot of respect for John Milton Gregory's book. That would be another segue in there. Even you're right, it's not exactly the same, but
Right.
the idea of getting the child involved in the education is important.
And I have read the Seven Laws of Teaching. It's a great book, and I see a lot of overlaps as well. I think it's
Yeah.
wonderful. It's very practical. Um, One of the questions I have, maybe Jason, you can pull some more examples of pedagogy. I mean, I know that you're an expert on narration. You've written a lot, both you and Patrick have written a lot on your Educational Renaissance newsletter, which I get every Saturday, and I love it. I read it. Wonderful. You guys have done such amazing research, not only with, like Lou is saying, some really good contemporary psychology that lines up to Charlotte Mason, but you guys have done a lot of research in the tradition. And I would really like you, Jason, to share like narration and other pedagogical practices that you see very connected to the tradition.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And so maybe the place I could start is with narration and the claim that I make in the book, Short History of Narration, that this is not something that, Charlotte Mason just made up on her own.
Right.
And so I went through and read a number of thinkers in the tradition, basically looked for anything like narration that Charlotte Mason proposes earlier on. And of course, we know from the Progymnosmata that narration was one of the main preliminary exercises. And you could think of it as just being an exercise for a rhetorical speech and therefore just a part of a rhetorical speech, but that's not really quite true. If you look at um, uh, George Kennedy's book on the rhetorical tradition, Christian and secular rhetorical tradition, he cites that basically Aelius Theon's the first or earliest progymnosmata textbook that we have, and he was in Alexandria about 100 CE. Um, Basically his method of teaching his students as a rhetorical teacher was to have them, he would read a text out to them in full, and then he would have them write out as much as they could remember from it. And so it was an exercise in written narration to basically train them in memory. We go just over, to Quintilian, not long after Aelius Theon, and he has some very specific tasks and even references using Aesop's fables, which is kind of referenced by Charlotte Mason as well. So my supposition, though you can see it in John Locke too, and Locke is dependent on Quintilian's opening chapters of on the education of an orator in a number of ways, but you can see that like the idea of young children starting out with narration, narrating Aesop's fables first, orally or in spoken format, and then moving on from there. Even when you get into kind of Middle Ages time period, obviously there's a shift in how rhetoric is being used, but you have Bernard of Chartres, being referenced by John of Salisbury in his Metallogicon as his main way of teaching. And I think this is in a monastery setting of
Mhm.
having basically his students come in the day after and be asked to recount everything that they had learned from the day before, all that they had read from the day before. And so
Yes,
you
and
have a
this is what
similar
we mean
format
by
there.
this is part of what we mean by self-education, not
Yeah,
just letting
they
kids
actually
go
have
and
to give
having
it
no
back.
accountability, right?
It's funny that the recitation, in a variety of different forms, but the idea that a student would have to come in and just tell back everything that they remembered that they had learned previously, um, I think was actually a kind of something, it wasn't necessarily practiced with the same discipline or um, uh, systematic in the same systematic nature. And that's exactly what Charlotte Mason says. It's like, we've done this sort of thing more or less. Everybody will say, she says in the sixth volume at some point. Yeah, but when you actually do it the way I'm saying to do it, it makes a huge difference, is in essence Charlotte Mason's claim. And so that's how I would justify the fact that she doesn't explicitly cite these areas that she could have gotten narration. John Locke, when he's talking about rhetoric, explains something very similar, a movement from oral narration to written narration. And there are a few others in the tradition that seem to be pretty clear, like Erasmus. He's again doing what Patrick was saying. He's engaging in a reading lecture through with explanations of the great texts. to students, and they are expected to not use notes as they get higher up. Notes are a crutch, says
Right.
Erasmus. A crutch for the mind. Only beginners should use them, but then they should write out, in essence, what they have learned. And he says, I know it takes time and trouble to the teacher, which implies then the teacher is receiving those written narrations or recitations of what he had shared with them, and in some sense grading them, looking over them and making sure that the students understood. So these are just a few examples through the tradition of this teaching practice, which is all about students really absorbing through telling. And I mean, I would be remiss not to mention John Amos Comenius, which is perhaps the place, along with Locke, that I could say with certainty she must have been drawing from,
Mhm.
because she says she thinks she found Comenius's golden key, how to help students, teachers teach less, but students learn more, the golden key of education. And that is right in his section on thoroughness in teaching and learning. He proposes a repeated narration process where the teacher would explain something fully and then pause and call on one student to explain it fully back, just like he had, and correct while that student is going, and then call on the next student to do the same
Mhm.
fully, and then correct, and then you go through all the students, so you have this repeated narration, so then they all know it fully because they've all been required to tell fully what they had just received from the teacher. So
But I like that Mason says sometimes with stories, you tell it once, want the child to repeat it word for word, but to put it in their own words so that they're in. And John Milton Gregory says something like that in 6 or 7, that the student can give it back, not regurgitation, but as if they've digested it and are giving it back. And I really encourage when I talk to in services and talk to parents, I said, ask your children at the dinner table, what did you learn today? And let them tell you the story in their own words.
mhm.
Because I think that again, they're still memorizing, but it's not like a parrot.
Right.
It's more like a human being internalizing and then giving it back.
That's right. That's
Yeah, and
right.
that feeding metaphor or digestion metaphor is completely there in Comenius, very strong. And then you see it in Mason a lot too. She uses the term assimilation and talks about the mind feeding on living ideas, and the poor quality textbooks that you were mentioning before being like sawdust in your mouth. You could imagine trying to chew on sawdust. So it's all over the place there.
Hmm. Hmm. And she does talk about how to plan a lesson properly and how to talk very little at the beginning, but give them something from which they can then be able to read the text and understand the context of it and then read it. Then she also in one of her principles talks about narration, Jason, that it's important to read the text only one time. But that's in the narration lesson. I don't think she's saying that the book should only be read once, because I've heard that as an argument that, well, in classical education, we think that it's okay to read books more than once. Could you expand on that a little, Jason? Because I know
Yeah,
you
and
understand that.
really, yeah, she's concerned that the habit of not remembering will be developed because, and it's really similar to the concern in, is it Plato's? Is it? No, it's not the Theaetetus. Which one is where he tells like the story of Thamos and the invention of writing in Egypt.
Yep,
And
I
the
know which
point is, I think Socrates' point is basically that writing is not going to be a source of like not wisdom. It's actually going to be a source of forgetting because
one.
we'll
Right.
write things down so that we won't have to remember them anymore, which is ironic because Plato's writing this all down. And so you have to wonder if he's a little bit tongue in cheek. But I think the idea for Mason is in particular that if you let students just go back to it again and again, which is what we do with our whole cram test forget kind of study up for a big test process. Um, that that will not train them to really attend fully to the text as they're encountering it the first time. It's just remarkably inefficient. And she's very aware that children's minds can attend with full interest to a text read one single time and then tell with remarkable ability that would just floor any of us as adults. And I've seen kids do this. It's amazing. And so she is recommending, in that sense, something different from Comedius, right? So Comenius has this repeated narrations and correct students, and she's like, don't do that with the young. It's a little bit similar to John Locke's advice for this type of thing. Um, but yeah, that's really what she's getting at. She's absolutely fine with students reading books again that are valuable. Especially if they were to read them on their own. The main point is the method of study. She just thinks that students should read it once, and then in narrating it, they will then know it.
Mhm.
And it's remarkable that we've got now a body of evidence on retrieval practice as a keystone of modern learning science that shows that when you do an initial test or assessment, it practically stops forgetting from happening. And so, in that way, I'd say she was ahead of her time, or she had discovered in practice with students something that we've since been able to reaffirm,
Mhm.
that it's to to have them immediately try to recall does something in the brain that initiates the long-term memory storage process that you wouldn't necessarily have otherwise. And then again, she doesn't mean we shouldn't keep thinking about it again and bring it back up in discussion or retell again a week from now a really great part of a story, and that's what we would do, those who follow Charlotte Mason's philosophy. So I think it would be a misunderstanding of her. She gives a lot of, I think it's important to distinguish when you're reading Mason between what she's putting forth as the big picture main principles or philosophy and the detailed encouragement, suggestions, advice that she's giving for how to apply her philosophy in a specific context. I think that's something that some people who are like Mason followers don't always do. They're like, we do the Charlotte Mason way always. And we believe whatever she says is, perfect and without error. And I think I mean, I understand that perspective. I mean, I think she has an amazing amount of wisdom, practical wisdom to share. But I do think it's important to distinguish between when she's giving detailed advice for what's a great way to teach this subject in this age group of students, and why you should not do this or do that, and
Mhm.
the broader principles. And so, of course, she's not going to agree with every classical educator in all the detailed, nuanced things. In fact, none of them agree with one another in many of those detailed encouragements for how to do this or that pedagogical task.
None
So,
of them ever have. Plato and Aristotle didn't even agree with each
no,
other.
no.
I mean, what Jason is saying segues nicely with another really important qualification because sometimes it seems like Mason is against memorization, and that's not the case. It is important to memorize things, but what she's saying is if you make them memorize 1,000 dates and battles and all this sort of stuff without giving them a big picture, it's just going to be dead. So they do memorize, but then you give them the story, which they pick up quickly. My son used to lecture with the Indiana Jones hat on third grade to the third graders on ancient Greece and Rome, and they loved it. They got into the story, and now that they have the story in their head, which again they remember, they can attach to it all the facts and figures and dates and battles and mountains that they're learning. So it's important. She's not against memorization, but she wants to give the students a big picture, a narrative that they can integrate the facts into. And I think that's a pretty good way of doing it.
What I would just add on to that too is the reason for this dichotomy between, again, it's really between Mason and Sayers on this, is partly because, well, in one sense, they're not talking to each other or about the same thing.
Yeah.
Sayers, in proposing a grammar stage for young children and the value of songs and chants for memorization, is talking just on a different wavelength than
Right.
Mace. She does not often talk about chants and songs for purposes of memorization. She doesn't take a stance against them, I would say, from my reading, and feel free to correct me if you guys can think of a passage. She doesn't take a stance against them. She's just not talking about them much. And again, maybe there's something in a Parents National Education Union article in the 40 years in which it was publishing that has something there. I definitely have not read them all. But uh, but what she is saying, and she is for memorization. They would memorize long passages of scripture and poems and all sorts of things. They would end up memorizing dates functionally for history. They would create a book of centuries and get the timeline in their minds. But I would put narration on a spectrum with memorization, where she's not expecting them to memorize each detail, but through the process of narrating it all, the student grasps the main lines of the whole, and so many of the facts. And so testing for her was done differently than that. So I'd say that's part of it. That's why these are brought up in contradiction to one another, partly because you have classical conversations and homeschool co-ops versus the Charlotte Mason homeschool co-op. This is going to do things differently as regards this, where one's going to focus on and emphasize narration, and the other's going to focus on memorizing a history timeline. And so, before we say they hate one another and they're in complete, enmity with one another, we could just say, well, they're just different. Like, they're just proposing different things. Maybe they're not actually contradictory, but they could be complementary.
Good point. Good point. Patrick, do you want to add anything to that?
Just talking about Sayer's essay, one of the thought exercises that I've done, and this will be too elaborate, so I'll try to truncate this, is if Sayers had never written her essay, could this whole classical shindig have gotten started? And I believe it could have, based on a Charlotte Mason passage. And it's in her second book when she describes her journey to Florence and she sees the fresco in Santa Maria Novella. And she sees the liberal arts arrayed in this fresco and the Holy Spirit coming down. And she describes beautifully what these 7 liberal arts are, how important they are, the coherence of them all. And you get all of these educational principles from what she describes as the Great Recognition. And when I read this passage in her second book, I think it's Parents and Children, I was like, this could have gotten the whole thing started. And so I encourage those who might see discord and disharmony between classicism and Charlotte Mason. And I know I've experienced this in the classical world, people who doubt that Charlotte Mason is relevant. And I've been to Charlotte Mason settings. I was at the Charlotte Mason Institute Centenary in Ambleside, England. And Karen Glass and I were these 2 people who represented the classical world. And every time somebody brought up classicism, all eyes turned to us, like, justify what you're doing. And so, I think there's sometimes an assumption that they are fundamentally incompatible. But when I read that, and again, I encourage people to read, it's later on in that volume,
I'll
it's
put it in the
so
show notes.
compelling.
It'll
It's
be in
so
the show notes.
compelling
Yeah.
to see that that alignment. So.
Yeah,
Well,
that's
and I
really
just
cool.
to put that in its historical context too, I did some work for my book for Classical Academic Press on Charlotte Mason in the Giants series, and the historical setting is so interesting because she's in Europe on a retirement because of burnout, health concerns, and while she's gone, the Parents National Education Union, which she had helped found and was kind of like the pedagogical leader of, is at the verge of being taken over by Lady Isabel Margison in the London office, and she's trying to centralize everything in London away from Bradford, where a lot of Charlotte Mason's early supporters in Bradford had launched the first Parents Education Union. And Lady Isabel Margison is trying to do so based on adopting more fully some of the progressive or modern educators that were, to a certain extent, in the background for Mason at the time. And so she's trying to push for Froebel and the kind of kindergarten playway methods and trying to like embrace fully and name some of these kind of modern semi-progressive educators, and Mason comes back with it almost gone, and hosts Lady Isabel and kind of talks her down, and then writes a few letters to those that she has supporters over there, and kind of stands on the tradition, and she's basically making, in a way, a firm movement at that point, going, no, actually, I don't think we're really about Froebel or Pestalozzi or Herbert Spencer. There's too strong of a Rousseauian push there. Why can't we just stand on the philosophers of all time,
Mhm.
and originate our own philosophy of education? And thereafter, when she basically wins the day by playing the conservative, habit training, Victorian, like let's stay where we are card, as opposed to rushing off after the kindergarten type of Froebel way, and naming our who we're following.
A
And
good way to put it, Jason, is that Charlotte Mason was a romantic, but she was not a utopian. She wasn't a
yeah,
progressivist utopian, thinking we're going to build a perfect society. She was
well, yeah.
about virtue formation. And she
And to
said,
go
I mean,
back to romanticism and
yeah,
say, she's quoting from Wordsworth and Coleridge,
right,
early romantics, and so to
right.
call her a romantic and not realize, okay, yeah, but she's not William Blake. She's not, Lord Byron. She's,
Yeah.
and it's true. William Wordsworth and Coleridge were utopian in their early
In
youth.
the early, and then
Were
they, yeah,
excited about the French Revolution, but then it all went wrong,
that's
and
right.
they grew up and had families and realized, hey, maybe this wasn't such a good
Right.
idea. And you've got like Wordsworth writing his ode to duty as a
Right.
poem,
That's
like
true.
embracing duty. And that's exactly where Charlotte Mason is vis-a-vis Rousseau. It's like, yes, we want to value children in a great way. We want to embrace the beauty of nature. We don't want to be under a straitjacket in our lives, but we also need to obey, and we want to accept order, and we don't want to enthrone reason and insanity, which is ironically what happens when you enthrone reason.
Yes.
It's like,
One of the things that I think we need to talk about, we're nearing the end, and I need to make sure we talk about this, is the idea of paideia. So, if one of you would maybe give a brief definition of paideia from the Greeks, and talk a little bit about what paideia is according to Charlotte Mason, because she definitely has a paideia, in my opinion, and I know you guys can speak to that. Would one of you share that?
Well, this is how I begin my book, the passing the torch. I just wanted to say, as a funny thing, to give a modern reference, unlike Jimmy Carter, Charlotte Mason would not have wanted them to sing John Lennon's Imagine at her funeral. So I don't know if you're up with that, right? I just read that today and I'm like, what the heck
Probably not.
is he
Yeah.
even thinking? He was a Christian too, Jimmy Carter. Anyway, but paideia is the Greek word. Today it's just the Greek word for children or childhood. But paideia means education, but it means education as enculturation. You're passing down the tradition. You're passing down the meaning of culture. And paideia, as it was used by Plato, Cicero used the word humanitas in almost the same way. And then we get the idea of humanity, or someone that has humanity is someone that embodies this culture. And the best way to embody it is by studying the humanities, the liberal arts. So they kind of go together that way. But another way to put that is the role of the true educator, especially the classical Christian educator, is not just to teach knowledge, but to pass down a culture, to pass down a tradition, a way of life, of virtue.
Mhm.
Well, and I think you can see that really clearly in that quotation from Abolition of Man that you shared earlier, Louis, just in terms of that we're passing something on, right?
Right.
We're not
Mhm.
manipulating the child, and I think that is key for Charlotte Mason, that the child is a person, that we are stewards, we're under a higher authority as we carry them on and try and lift them up and educate and enculturate them. We can't just do anything we want to their
Right.
person. We have to respect them, and that for her means that that education should be an atmosphere, a discipline, and a life. And so I think that idea of atmosphere really settles in with Paideia, that culture, the home atmosphere that surrounds them, the atmosphere of relationships, the beauty of art, the cultural artifacts that are going to enrich them, and the ideas that they contain, and that all is kind of about the child. And we want to let them breathe that in naturally. So there's a natural atmosphere to that, but it's also going to be a civilizing influence. And I think also in Paideia is the is the idea of discipline. The idea,
Mhm.
I mean, that when we translate "bring up your children in the discipline and nurture of the Lord," Paideia also, in at least Koine Greek times, is including the beating. And of course, the Greeks would often have a slave functioning as the pedagogue, the pedagogos, bringing the child to the tutor and potentially responsible for the child's discipline and looking after them at that time. So for Mason, the development of habit and the
Mhm.
formation of habits, and that there's a mentor and guide who's trying to bring that student along to their education, to their kind of drinking from the fountain of those true, good, and beautiful things. That's going to be a part of it too, in addition to all the life, the living ideas, the taking it all in and making it their own, and becoming inspired by the important things of the
Mhm.
tradition.
Patrick, what would you add to that with the especially
Yeah,
discipline and
Jason
habits?
mentioned the biblical tradition. I think 2 Timothy 3:16, where you have all scripture, all graphe, is breathed out by God and profitable for teaching, for reproof, for correction, and for training in righteousness. And that training word is paideia. And I think when we see a passage like this, we are, it has in view children, but also we ourselves. And I think when we're talking about Charlotte Mason, we're often viewing children, often viewing young children. But I think the principles are sound for all people for all time, right? That we, the children of God, have this training, this paideia, where the mind of God is disseminated, and that our righteousness is accomplished through that training, through that paideia, the learning and the consistent practice of these things that occurs through reading, but also, as Jason had mentioned, reproof and correction and teaching and all of that. So, yeah, I think there's that biblical classical tradition that we're hearkening back to when we think about paideia.
Mhm. Mhm. And we see that in Charlotte Mason's
Mhm.
methods.
Yes.
Habit training. We didn't talk very much about habit training. We could talk for 3 hours on habits and Aristotle. Does anybody want to add any little thoughts there, just to throw something out?
When I think about memorization and songs and habit training, one of the things that struck me in reading Aristotle is that with young children, they would they would dance and do gymnastic to train the body, not just to keep them still, but to actually learn beautiful forms of movement, right? And they would do the same with song. You would learn choruses and you would actually recite great orations. And it wasn't necessarily solely to memorize information, it was to become well practiced in saying fitting words, of having beautiful ideas soak into the child and train the mouth. So when we think about young ones, what most needs to be trained? The mouth and the body. And so I do think habit training early on occurred through song and dance. And they were there for that purpose of presenting to the child the best of music, the best of movement. And and I think we can have a low view of what habit training is. And there's so much about micro habits and atomic habits and, cues and responses. And I think this is something different. This is really envisioning our most mature self, or the best version of ourselves. How do we have those exemplars that we are fixing in our minds so that we are accomplishing the best, not just through force of will, but there's a compelling drawing to this flame that is uh, the exemplars. I mean, that's virtue ethics right there, is having compelling exemplars that inspire us and we want to be like them. It's the old, I want to be like Mike. When we see him dunk the basketball, we're going to go out there and train real hard. And I think there are so many compelling exemplars that we read about, that we see in great paintings and we hear in music.
Okay, thank you. Well, I would like to close our discussion asking each of you to share a Charlotte Mason quote that you think pertains to this discussion about her fitting into the tradition.
One of the ones I like is, and it just as true today. Our schools today, she says, they turn out a good many clever young persons, wanting in nothing, lacking in nothing, except initiative, the power of reflection, and the sort of moral imagination which enables you to put yourself in someone else's place. And so, again, she is opposed to utilitarian education, right? She's not against learning a trade, but she's against just something, almost like a sophistical, a sophist kind of education. She wants an education that gives a child initiative, the power of reflection. And moral imagination means, and even Percy Shelley understood this, a sympathetic imagination that allows you to move out of yourself and see it through the eyes of like Atticus teaches his daughter in To Kill a Mockingbird, walking in someone's shoes. And what's the best way to do that? But giving them lots and lots and lots of the best stories ever written, and you get them in there. So we're not just trying to produce straight A students who can do well in a test. So she would have hated modern teaching for the test nonsense. She was attacking it over 100 years ago, and we're back with it again. And we need to be reminded that it's not just about passing a test. It's about, again, forming a character. A lifelong learner, we would also say that today. She would definitely be in favor of lifelong learning. So, sometimes we think we've succeeded and we really haven't, right? That's why the what is it called? The good soil. They did a huge survey of all the different schools, classical Christian, regular Christian, and the classical Christian students came out on top in terms of lifelong learning and continuing to read and continuing to learn and all of these things. I think Charlotte Mason would have ranked high in the good soil as well.
Mhm.
Definitely. I can build off that with my quote, which um, is about the formation of character too, and the habits and habit training that we're just talking about. And really, I mean, this is where you can see her connecting with the tradition so clearly, and it might be the central early formation or early idea that she embraced. And it's, for Plato, just like Mason, the singular goal of education is that formation of character. And so she wrote this in a pamphlet that was circulated just to help start that first parents education union in 1888. She said, almost anything may be made of a child by those who first get him into their hands. We find that we can work definitely towards the formation of character, that the habits of the good life, of the alert intelligence, which we take pains to form in the child, are somehow registered in the very substance of his brain, and that the habits of the child are, as it were, so many little hammers beating out by slow degrees the character of the man. Therefore, we set ourselves to form a habit in the same matter of fact, steady way that we set about teaching the multiplication table, expecting the thing to be done and done with for life. I love that quote because of how she focuses early on very much on habit training. It's one of the one or singular idea that's written into the constitution of the Parents National Education Union, even. And it's in some ways what she falls back on. It's what's the whole point? The character of the child at the end, not just whatever we might feel, not just that we covered material or something like that. It's what actually happened to the child. Who did the child become? What type of person did they become? And if we just focus on all sorts of other things and miss that alert intelligence and the habits of the good life, well, we're missing what it's all about.
Okay,
For
Patrick.
me, I go to the very passage I described earlier in The Great Recognition, going to Florence, seeing how the mind of the Middle Ages, the seedbed of the Renaissance, is something that inspired her to really have this crystallization of what education is all about. So she writes, but the Florentine mind of the Middle Ages went further than this. It believed not only that the seven liberal arts were fully under the direct outpouring of the Holy Spirit, but that every fruitful idea, every original conception, whether in Euclid or grammar or music, was a direct inspiration from the Holy Spirit, without any thought at all as to whether the person so inspired named himself by the name of God or recognized whence his inspiration came. And what's wonderful about this is somebody who is in this classical Christian education renewal movement, there isn't a dichotomy between the sacred and the secular in the sense that when I'm teaching Euclid, I am no longer teaching the mind of God. It is fully inspired by the Holy Spirit, disseminating true things throughout the entire universe. And that I don't need to come up with some form of hokey, daily verse to make triangle theorems somehow holy. They are already inspired by the mind of God. So I found this to be just such a crystallization of, a really well thought out epistemology of what our source of knowledge is. So,
Oh, that's great.
Hey,
I would,
Adrian, I
yeah.
thought of a clever pun that you could use. So Charlotte Mason starts this PNEU, the PNU. And, the founder, she's the mother or the ma. So I'm now saying that Charlotte Mason is the pneuma, which is actually the Greek word for spirit. So she's
They did
inspiring
make
us.
that connection. She
Oh,
actually
did she
tried
make
to
that?
call her methods the pneumatic
Oh,
methods,
okay. Well, there it was then, because I'm looking at it. I said
spirit-based
pneuma.
methods. Yeah. And so she was aware. She
Oh, that's great.
yeah.
It's the word for spirit that Jesus uses in John 3. Yeah.
I love it. I love it. Well, thank you all for joining me today on this really important conversation. I plan to have a few more discussions in this same arena for our listeners so that we can help clarify where we stand with Charlotte Mason in the tradition for those who might be confused. So I really appreciate your time. Thank you, Lou, Jason, and Patrick.
Adrian, thank you so much for putting this together. It's been a pleasure to meet with you all.
Thank you.